Tippett, and I'm the Vice President of the St. Louis Space Frontier.
We have mics now.
I'm only 2 minutes away,
Okay, I was gonna say,
but they didn't need
they're very, I just replaced the batteries in channel 2. Channel 1's not working.
So every second Thursday, the St. Louis Space Frontier presents something in either this room or across the hall in the other room, the conference room, and it's always about space. Tonight we're very fortunate to have 3 solar system ambassadors with us. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you all for being here. We are really excited to be here. This is our first time at the Venture Cafe. As Judy mentioned, we are Solar System Ambassadors, which means we are with a volunteer program through NASA. So we're local. I'm Lindsay, this is John, and this is Chris. And we will be talking a little bit about, briefly, Apollos 1 through 17, focusing on Apollo 11 because next week, July 20th, is the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, which is very exciting. And then we will talk a little bit about Artemis. Artemis in Greek mythology was Apollo's twin sister. So Artemis is going to be our future moon landing in 2024. And then after that, we'll take some questions. So before we talk about how do we get to the moon, let's talk about why, right? Like, why did this happen? Why are we on the moon?
Meet the Russians.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. So it's the race to space, right? We are very competitive. And then in 1962, John F. Kennedy gives his speech. We're going to watch just a quick clip of that.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Okay, so 1962, JFK makes the ask, and we have to do this before 1970. We get there within about 6 months, right? So let's look at the timeline. So 1969, we land on the moon, but there's a lot of stuff that happens before then. So 1957, the Russians launch Sputnik, their first satellite. And that's scary for us a little bit. We don't know what they're going to do with that, and then starts the space race. 1958 is when NASA is formed. And then before then, we have to really do a lot of stuff before we get to the moon. We have the Mercury mission, and then the Gemini mission and Apollo. Mercury will have 1 astronaut in their command module, Gemini will have 2, and Apollo will have 3. The Mercury mission is really going to be focusing on, can we do this? We've never been in this environment before. Can we even press buttons in space? That's what the Mercury mission is going to be about. We're going to have Alan Shepard. He will be our first American in space, and he will fly the Freedom 7 for about 15 minutes. So that will be kind of the Mercury mission. They're going to be completely different astronauts than Gemini and Apollo. They're going to be the test pilots, right? So they're going to be different. And the Gemini and Apollo, they're going to kind of overlap a little bit. Gemini mission is really going to focus on rendezvous. A rendezvous is when you have 2 spacecrafts that will connect when they're in orbit together. And then that's going to be really important for the Apollo 11 because they're going to dock and then take out the lunar lander and then fly to the moon. Can't use my hands here. So then the Apollo is strictly going to the moon. So that's what we have for the timeline. And then, as I mentioned, the astronauts are going to be a little different, right? So the Mercury guys, they're going to be the test pilots, the frat bros. They're going to be, people that get America rallied behind this. They're going to go have the ticker tape parades. And then the Apollo and Gemini astronauts, they're going to have to be in space for days. They're going to have a different skill set. And I think it's really important that we talk about who is involved in all this, right? So it's estimated that 400,000 people were involved to get us to the moon. So we all hear Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, but there are so many people behind the scenes that we don't address. So we have people that are actually handwriting these equations, people like Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Macy Roberts, and then we also have people in the command room, and we have people that are doing the science behind this. How do they do the rocket fuel? How do they build the rockets? People that have to actually do the material to build the rocket themselves. So there's a lot of people that go that are involved in this. I think it's really important that we see some faces and get some names to get all of that behind this. Like I mentioned, we have, so this is the Mercury 7, the original astronauts for the Mercury. Alan Shepard, as I talked about, and then we'll have John Glenn. He will be doing the first orbit, so he'll be in orbit for about 5 hours. He'll go around the Earth about 3 times. And then the Gemini, this is the Gemini 9. Later on there will be 16 because we have 2 astronauts in the command module. But Frank Borman's in there and Neil Armstrong. And then we're going to go right into starting with Apollo 1. The first Apollo mission ends in tragedy. Ed White, Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, they lose their lives in Apollo 1. We learned so much from this accident, and we were doing everything the same for Mercury and Gemini. We were doing 100% oxygen, the pressure was all the same, but there was a spark in Apollo 1, and it caused a huge fire, and the hatch blew in, and they lost their lives. And I think it's also important that we see their faces and understand that these astronauts understood the risk. Humans have our human nature is to explore and to be adventurers, but there's a cost. These are real people, and they went through some really, really scary stuff. This is a very dangerous adventure, but this was Apollo 1, and then we're going to go right into how did we actually get to the moon from here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, when President Kennedy set the challenge, the only thing that we had really done with rockets was bombs. We had not done anything with astronauts, let alone get to the moon. So before we could build the rockets and design this, we had to come up with a plan. How are we going to get to the moon? And that may sound like a silly question because we've done it, but it was completely unknown at the time. And one idea would be the direct approach. Launch a spacecraft, fly that spacecraft to the moon, turn it around, and fly back home. That's kind of the flying saucer thing that we see in all the science fiction movies, the thing that lands and turns around and leaves. But another idea would be to rendezvous in Earth orbit. In other words, to have multiple launches, put things in orbit around the Earth, and then put them together and take that spacecraft to the moon and back. The advantage there is you can launch something a little bit smaller, but it requires multiple launches. And the third idea is what's called lunar orbit rendezvous. Lunar orbit rendezvous is we launch from Earth and go into orbit around the moon. Then we have one spacecraft that breaks off and lands at the moon, comes back and docks here, and then that returns to the Earth. So we had to decide which method we were going to do. And interestingly, Wernher von Braun, who was Mr. Rocket Science of the time, advocated this one, the Earth Orbit Rendezvous. And that's something that's kind of forgotten since then because a relatively unknown person, John Hobart, was the champion of the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And what the director of NASA did at the time was to have them present the other one's idea. And when they did, Wernher von Braun looked at it and said, Hobart's idea is better. And the main reason for that is this. With the Earth Orbit Rendezvous or the direct landing, we would have needed something 65 feet tall to land on the moon and come back. Whereas with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, we were able to do this with a much smaller lunar excursion vehicle, which was only 14 feet tall and quite small in terms of weight. So this was a huge advantage, but as Lindsay mentioned, the one question was, could we dock in space? Could we rendezvous two pieces of space equipment because this can't come home? And that was the whole idea of the Gemini program, was to prove that we could do that. So this is the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous procedure. We launch from Florida because it's easier to get into orbit the closer you are to the equator. And that's the closest we had in the United States. And so we would go into Earth orbit, and over Hawaii, we would make a translunar injection to bring our spacecraft out of Earth orbit and toward the moon. We did that over Hawaii because this section is the critical time for communication, and we would then be across the United States. Back then, we didn't have satellite communication, so if you were out here, it was very difficult to communicate with the United States. We had to have relay stations on ships and around the world. It was much more difficult than today. Then the spacecraft catches up with the moon. The moon is coming this way, and we need to catch up with it on its leading edge. If we catch up to it on its trailing edge, the gravity of the moon is going to send us away. And this was what's called a free return trajectory. In other words, the gravity of the moon is going to pull us this way, and if we don't do anything, we'll come back to Earth. And that was very helpful in Apollo 13, because Apollo 13 had an explosion here and was able to use that free return trajectory even without firing their engines very much to be able to come home. Then once we orbit the moon, we are inserting into the lunar orbit, then we descend into the moon, and one astronaut stays in lunar orbit while two astronauts then land on the moon, come back and rendezvous, and then return home. Every Apollo landing was in the lunar morning. And the reason for that was a couple of things. Number one, if you're going to land someplace that no one has ever been, clearly vision is extremely important. And so if you land at high noon, it's very hard to get three-dimensional views because everything is washed out. And instead, if you can land when the sun is low, then the shadows are much more helpful. Another reason was temperature. The temperature on the moon at night reaches about minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And at high noon on the moon, it reaches about plus 270. So if you land early in the morning, then you're catching that change around 0 degrees, and it's much more hospitable to the astronauts. But this is the reason, if you notice over here, on all the Apollo pictures, you never see stars. And people ask that question, why are there no stars in the picture? Well, because it's daytime. If we go outside here in the daytime and take pictures, you won't see any stars. But you'll see a blue sky because we have atmosphere. On the moon, there's no atmosphere, so the sky is black, but it's extremely bright, and the astronauts had these gold-plated visors because they were exposed to the sun, and it was extremely difficult for them to see. A day on the moon is about 29 and a half days long on Earth. We don't really have time to go into the details, but the bottom line is the moon is locked in a synchronized orbit. So it turns on its axis one time in the same length of time it takes it to revolve around the Earth. So the morning lasts about 1 day. The reason that's important is if the mission misses its launch window, they have to wait another month before they can launch again and land in the morning. They can't just launch the next day. To get there required an enormous rocket. This was the Saturn V rocket. And if we look up here, this is the command module. That's the only part that comes back. That's where the 3 astronauts launched. And on top of that was a launch escape system. In case something went wrong on launch, they could pull a switch and actually fire a rocket there that would pull them off and land in the Atlantic Ocean. And then below that was the service module and 5 enormous rockets here at the base. One thing that I want to point out with this slide is not just the size of this, but look at all the companies involved. We have Boeing, North American, Douglas Corporation, IBM, Grumman, Lockheed, Chrysler. All of these companies are subcontractors. NASA didn't build anything. NASA contracted all of these to be done. And all of these American companies were involved in the building of this rocket. It was an enormous undertaking. And for size, we can see here, this is a Saturn V that was not used. It is on display at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And is that you, John?
No, not this one.
You're not in this one? Okay. That's somebody about John's size. And you can see here, this is the command module, the launch escape system, and the entire enormous rocket that was in stages. For sizing, again, this was about the size of a football field end to end, 363 feet. And looking at it in comparison to the arch of 630 feet. And there's John again. So the first stage used about 40,000 pounds of fuel per second and only lasted 2 minutes. The stage was gone after 2 minutes. And within 11.5 minutes, they were in orbit around the Earth. The second stage then used a combination of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen and came at about 115 miles of altitude. And the S4B stage, that's the one that was made by Douglas Corporation. It was not made in St. Louis, but it was made by Douglas Corporation that was centered in St. Louis, and it was made in California. That was the final stage. So this very flimsy lunar module that's going to land was much too small in terms of its capabilities to be launched in our atmosphere. So it had to be protected inside the S4B stage. So what would happen is once they left the Earth orbit, the astronauts in the command module separated out, turned around, and all while going about 24,000 miles per hour, and come back and dock with the lunar module and pull it out of the S4B stage. Then this connected piece, the command module with one engine and the lunar module, then goes off to the moon. They had to be very careful not to then run into this because it's on its way to the moon as well. And so what they did was to burn this engine and either crash this into the moon or send it in its own orbit around the sun. Interestingly, in 2002, there was an amateur astronomer that thought that he had found a new asteroid orbiting the sun. He contacted NASA, and they evaluated this with spectroscopy and recognized that it was man-made. And it wasn't an alien ship, it was the S4B section from Apollo 12. It was orbiting the sun, and you can still see it. This is what it looks like. So we have the lunar lander here, the command module with the astronauts, and the service module with one remaining engine. This does not have to be aerodynamic, because in space, in a vacuum, you do not have to fly in an atmosphere. So the two astronauts will crawl through here into the lunar module, and this will break off, and the lunar module goes to land, while this continues orbiting the moon. And this is the lunar module photographed directly from the command module as it's pulling off and heading to land on the moon. And this will just give us a brief overview of the Apollo 11 mission from start to finish. The Apollo 11 astronauts did not put their names on the patch. They felt that this was a combined effort. They didn't want their names on it.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines on. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Shadow. 4 forward, 6 into the right level. 30 seconds forward. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Rocket Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to
Armstrong is on the move. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
All clear for man. 1, 5, I've never complied out here. I've never complied on the way. Tranquility Base, unit, guidance recommendation is pinged, and you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, that's it. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
So we landed on the moon 6 times. Apollo 11 was the first, Apollo 17 was the final mission before the budget was cut. And in choosing the site to land, they had to consider various issues. Number one, they wanted to land someplace smooth. So they wanted to land in one of these smooth areas that we call seas or mare. What these are ancient lava fields where the lava has smoothed out the area, and they're younger sites, so they have not had complete impact craters like many of the other areas of the moon. So one thing was smoothness, another was on the equator, because they're orbiting around the equator with that free return trajectory, so they wanted to land on the equator. So look at this site for Apollo 11 in the Sea of Tranquility. It's directly on the equator in a nice, smooth area.
So to highlight Apollo 11, July 20th, 1969, it was an 8-day adventure, and we all have heard of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, but I really like to focus on Michael Collins. I think he kind of gets forgotten in all of this, which is so unfortunate because he's such a crucial part of this mission, right? So he's going to be the lone astronaut circling, orbiting the moon, while the 2 guys are on the moon. So I think it says a lot about his character that he was able to be completely alone. He was the first astronaut to orbit the moon by himself. And at one point, he's behind the moon, and there's a section of radio silence where he can't hear Capcom. So he's completely alone. And I think it says a lot about him that he was able to handle all of that, and as well as the pressure that he's got to get all 3 of them back, right? So he's orbiting, and then all of a sudden, Neil and Buzz have to come and meet him, and then everybody goes home. So poor Michael Collins gets forgotten, but you won't forget him now. So they are going to fly the Columbia, which is the command module, and then they're going to go, the lunar module is going to be the Eagle that lands. So as I was mentioning before, the Mercury astronauts are going to be different than the Apollo astronauts, right? So these guys were all pilots. They all flew planes, they all could fly helicopters as well. Helicopter training was very important because they didn't know exactly who was going to be flying the lunar module, and that is pretty similar. They also had to do some survival training. So in the video you saw, they landed in the Pacific Ocean. Well, if their trajectory is wrong, and they end up in the desert or in the jungle, you did this amazing trip to the moon, and then you die coming back to Earth. So they wanted to do some survival training. People think that's because you go to the moon and then you don't know what's going on there. It's actually from when you come back to Earth, and if your trajectory is wrong, you don't know where you're going to end up. So they would actually send them to the Mojave Desert, and they would spend a couple nights there and do survival training. They also had to train as geologists. So these guys were, they had to go to Iceland and check out rocks, and they were studying what they wanted to see when they got to the moon. They had to know what they were looking for, what they were identifying, and what they wanted to bring back as far as samples. So I think that's really interesting, as well as they had to train to be able to read what's called a sextant, and it is how you navigate the stars. There's no north, south, east, west, up or down in space, and so they really needed to be able to have that as kind of a backup. And like I said, they're all pilots, and then we're going to watch...
Michael Collins continued orbiting the moon.
Quiet you, sir. So they're going to land on the moon, and in the last video you heard 30 seconds, 15 seconds. Well, that is how much fuel they have left, how many seconds of fuel they have left. So there you hear Buzz say 30 seconds. Neil Armstrong sees this gigantic crater that we're going to see here in a second. He sees this crater, and he takes over manually and flies it and lands perfectly on it. This is the crater. He's going to fly it over, and they're going to land safely. And I think it really says a lot about him as well that he was able to deal with all that pressure so quickly. They're going to take about 2.5 hours only of EVA. So they're really not there very long. The Apollo 11 is basically check mark, we got to the moon, let's get back safely. And so 2.5 hours of EVA time, and they really only go about 36 meters in distance, really. They don't want to venture too far from the module. And so they grab some samples, not too much, and the rocks that they see are pretty jagged, and because there's no atmosphere, no erosion, they're all pretty sharp. Can you pause it right there real quick? So these are the reflectors that they put down. And we can actually hit those with high-powered lasers here and reflect off of that. And because of this is the only reason we know this, is that the moon is actually leaving us 1 inch every year. It's from measuring the distance from the high-powered lasers that are hitting these. So that was a very important thing that they did. And so I mentioned there's no atmosphere. This is Buzz Aldrin. He's moving, but you see the flag is not. So they put a rod in the top, rod in the bottom, and that just kind of demonstrates how there's no atmosphere.
Well, after Apollo 11, the question came, why go back? We proved that we could do it and come home safely. So the missions changed from beating the Russians, getting there and getting back, to learning about the moon and about the Earth. And so each mission got successively more complicated. And Apollo 12 was designed to have a pinpoint landing. They landed within 100 meters of the Surveyor probe that had landed there unmanned 2.5 years earlier. So they had a very pinpoint landing. And by Apollo 15, they had moved ahead to having a lunar rover that could travel as much as 2 and 3 kilometers. So as Lindsay mentioned, with Apollo 11, they never moved more than the area about the size of a baseball diamond. But by Apollo 15, we were going 2 and 3 miles in diameter. And I just put this up here to show a couple of things. One is this mountain range, the Apennine Mountains. The topography of the moon is incredibly interesting. And these mountains are 15,000+ feet tall. They're very similar to the Alps in their view. And Apollo 15 landed right in the center of this mountain range. It was an incredible feat to fly in and land in this mountain range. And if anybody is interested, you can get a really good feel for this with a small telescope. This picture on the right is one that I took a couple of weeks ago, just with a 4-inch refractor in my front yard. So you can kind of crater hop around and see exactly in this mountain range next to Mount Hadley, which is this right here. So Apollo 15, we're going to watch them come in. Here's this Apennine mountain range. Incredibly high mountains, and they're going to come in and land right in this valley next to the Hadley Rill, which is an ancient lava flow river. So if you remember the video from Apollo 11, the area was extremely smooth. Now look at this. This is like landing in Denver. And you're coming in over the mountains and landing right here in this Hadley Rill. So it was an amazing feat of engineering to be able to land there. And fortunately, because of that, we learned that these mountains were not formed by volcanic activity. They seem to have been formed at the time that the moon formed. Here's the lunar rover that they used to drive, and there's Mount Hadley in the background, 15,000 feet high. Here's that gold-plated visor because the sun is so bright when they were there on the moon. The final mission was Apollo 17. They landed in a valley that is deeper than the Grand Canyon. And so they're over here near the Sea of Serenity. And they're going to come in and fly down into this very low valley and land at the bottom, essentially, of a Grand Canyon. This was an incredible mission because it showed the age of the moon with the rocks that were found from this mission, and this one's the first mission to have a professional geologist go on as an astronaut. They were able to identify rocks dating back 4.1 billion years. And the oldest rocks that we have anywhere from the Earth-Moon system are from the moon, because you can see these boulders that have rolled down the hill. You can see where they came from because there's no erosion, nothing changes. So you know where the boulders rolled down from. And British look at that and say Americans don't pick up their trash. While they were there on this mission, it was very fortunate that they did have a professional geologist, because while they were driving in their lunar rover, everything around is gray and dull brown. And then suddenly, at the top of this crater, and there's that low sun again, they came across at Shorty Crater a shocking find. I've got to work on my timing. I'm surprised I'm trying to say that right as the find comes in. Here it is. Orange. In this whole moon that is all dull gray, they spot this orange rock. And what they found was beads of glass that were volcanic, that had been buried underneath the surface and brought to the surface by an impact crater. And they were able to bring these beads home and identify this was probably the biggest piece of information to show that the moon had been completely molten in its early development. The gravity on the moon is about 1/6 of what it is on the Earth, and so it's extremely difficult for the astronauts to deal with that. And often we can see people stumbling a little bit. Didn't see that rock. And getting up from the position is a little more difficult. They have to try to figure out. And watch as he falls forward, how slowly he falls. And then he's able to kind of push himself back up because of the lower gravity. And a lot of the astronauts found that it was actually easier to hop around than to try to walk.
How much does that tack weigh on the back of his back?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
50 pounds?
Yeah.
I think it was 100 pounds like that, but on the moon was like 25. It wasn't much. That's gravity.
Now, in this video, what we're going to see is the final mission leaving the moon. And what's interesting about this will split into parts. That part leaves, and you see there's no smoke because there's no atmosphere. There's just sparks that fly out, and you can see the descent module still sitting there. And then they rendezvous with the command module back in orbit around the moon. And before we leave the Apollo program, I will leave you with this and turn it over to John. We have a lunar reconnaissance orbiter camera that is currently orbiting the moon, taking high-definition pictures. This image on the right is a high-definition picture taken of the Apollo 7 landing site in 2011, so more than 40 years after the event. This on the left was a picture taken out the window as the astronauts were leaving on Apollo 17. You can see the descent module here. You can see this white rock here for reference. You can see the double tracks from the wheels on the lunar rover, and those are still here in the same position. And right there, you can see a little white spot with a black shadow. That's the flag that they planted on the moon with that mission. And over here, you can still see the shadow. So we know that the flags are all still flying, except for Apollo 11 got knocked over, but all the others from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter we know are still flying, or sitting, not actually flying.
So as Lindsay mentioned,
our plan, our program to get back to the moon is called ARTEMIS. So hopefully in the next 4 years, we'll see a lot of things happening. So this mission, this program is in 2 phases. Phase 1 has started and will end in 2024 with the humans returning back to the lunar surface. And then phase 2 will go from 2024 to 2028, where we'll build so we can have a long-term presence on the moon. Interestingly for me, I was about 12 years old when Apollo 11 landed. It really drove a lot of things I wanted to do in my life. I thought it was really fantastic. And I thought by now we would be having colonies on Mars. So hopefully the politics and the funding don't get in the way and this program actually continues, because they really have accelerated. They've ramped up to try and hit these dates, and a lot of things are happening. So in order to do this, we need a new rocket. We need something that can carry even more payload than the biggest rocket we ever made, which is the Saturn V. So we have the Space Launch System, or SLS rocket, and then we have a new spacecraft for the astronauts called Orion. So this will be the largest payload mass and volume capability that we've ever had. And it will not only get us to the moon, but also hopefully onto Mars and other places in our solar system. So just to give you some background, the technology here is not new. This is very well-tested technology. The boosters come from the shuttle program. On the shuttle program, they were 4 sections. These have been increased to 5 to give additional thrust. The core stage has the RS-25 engine, which is the liquid hydrogen oxygen engine that's been used on shuttle in the main engines there. So this will give us 8.8 million pounds of thrust. The Saturn V was around 6-point-something million. The upper stage has J2 engines. Those were the kind that were used on Apollo or in the Saturn V. And then the Orion spacecraft will hold up to 6 astronauts. It's 1.5 times the size of Apollo and will give us some more versatility to bring more people to the moon and beyond. As part of this, we're going to take a different approach than we did in Apollo. In Apollo, we went up there, we did the undocking, we sent down the lunar module, we came back, docked, and then we threw it away, essentially. So we're going to come up with something here that gives us more reusability and more sustainability. So it's called the Gateway. It's like a mini space station. And for the 2024 landing, they're going to have 2 modules there. It's going to be a very minimal configuration to get us started. So this gives you a timeline. So from now until 2024, we should see a succession of launches happening. ARTEMIS 1, for those who may have seen previous NASA information on this kind of program, was called EM1 for exploratory missions. So now that we have the name ARTEMIS, that's been tagged into the program. So that first flight we will take at the spacecraft out to the Earth, to the lunar orbit. It'll be a 21-day mission, 6 days at the moon. It's basically a test. Let's test out all the equipment before we put people in there. And it will also test the new heat shield. Now, some of you may remember that we did a heat shield test a couple years ago. It was a different heat shield. So now we have a new and improved one. So that'll be on the Orion when it goes up for this first test mission. Then ARTEMIS 2 will take the first humans to the moon. It kind of sounds like the Apollo 8 mission where we went to the moon and just flew by, but it's a little different. We're going to take the spacecraft and put it in a very long Earth orbit for several days so that the astronauts can check out every system in that spacecraft and in that rocket. Then they're going to go to the moon and do a flyby and do that free return trajectory and come back and land. Then we'll launch a couple of the stages, the sections for the Gateway. There'll be a high-powered solar electric system there, as well as a pressurized crew module. And then the ARTEMIS 3, we will take the astronauts up to the Gateway And then in the new lunar module, which doesn't even exist yet, NASA's just reviewing some of the submitted plans for that and looking to pick someone, a new lunar module to be built, and go down to the moon and then come back to the gateway. And that lunar module will stay at the gateway so that the next crew that goes can use it again. So it'll be used over and over and over again. So you can see some other interesting things here. You have ISRU, In Situ Resource Utilization, an acronym that basically says before the astronauts get there, we're going to land all this stuff there to help them out. So there'll be a lot of commercial companies involved as well as NASA putting all of this together. So by 2024, hopefully we are landing at the lunar South Pole because we believe there's water there. And we want to really check it out. That will give us a lot of capability in the future if we can find that there. So NASA will be sending the first woman to the moon, and these are the candidates. So there are currently 12 astronauts. These are the requirements that have been set by the NASA administrator, and 8 of these astronauts qualify at this moment. 4 of them have not been to the space station yet. So to qualify to go to the moon, hopefully in the next couple of years they get that opportunity to go to the space station. So I think it's a really exciting time. Again, I hope it just continues. The political will hopefully is there and continues to take us there to 2024 and then on into 2028 and who knows beyond that. Because we're not going to the moon just to do it again. We're going there so that we can test a lot of ideas and things to get us to Mars. Because the moon is really, really close in comparison to Mars. It's a 2-year round trip to Mars at this point with the technology we have. 6 months to get there. You might as well stay for a year if you're going to be going that long, and then 6 months back. So the technology required for that, it's not going to be a capsule. There's going to be some kind of a larger space habitat that goes, and many, many things to figure out. Just like as we've had our astronauts on the space station for a year now, we're testing how will the human body do, because when you go to Mars, you're going to be gone for 2 years in space. So I think it's an exciting time. It's interesting, some of the things I start to see popping up. I don't know if you've noticed, there's more commercials now that have space themes. Mars themes are popping up. Where I live, I noticed a billboard for Mars plumbing. Now, I think they've been around for a long time, but it caught my eye because Mars is kind of, on people's minds these days. So
We're on Mars.
True. So hopefully this gives you some insight into the past and also into the future, and we're ready for questions.
Is it really necessary to have a damn CIA agent on the moon?
CIA agent on the moon.
Spy versus Spy, it was Mad Magazine.
One of those candidates must have come from the CIA.
Do we know which one?
You said they're going to reuse the lunar module, so they're not leaving parts down there every time.
Well, they have to still figure it all out, but the idea is to make it reusable. But you can't leave like the base platform there and launch, because now I guess you'd have to come back and land right there.
Yeah.
So there probably isn't a lot of sense in breaking it in pieces if you can go back and forth with something that's going to carry. And there'll be 4 astronauts going to the moon, to the gateway. 2 of them will go to the moon. So one of those first 2 back to the moon will be a woman. So.
What about the fuel for that lunar lander as it's?
Well,
how is that going to be generated? Is it going to be generated there, or is it going to be carried up there?
Initially, it would have to be carried up there. So at this point, since it doesn't exist, I really don't know what the fuel system will be. It may be liquid hydrogen oxygen, I'm not sure. But just like at the ISS, where initially on the space station, we had to take water up there all the time because we had to replenish that. We now have a system that lets us regenerate all the water that's on the station. So all of the wastewater gets cleaned, and the astronauts, 90+% of it gets recycled back. So I would assume that long-term 2028 and beyond plan, assuming we find water, that there'll be technology applied to that to hopefully make the fuels.
Has
saw a wonderful video of the Von Braun wheel. Are you familiar with it? And it seemed like on that video they were calling it Artemis also. Do you know if that's true?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard it.
I don't think the room could hear the question.
The question was, Von Braun had a design for a rotating wheel spacecraft, and she said she thinks it was called Artemis. I don't remember ever seeing that, so that's something I'll have to look at.
I just looked it up.
Yeah.
I just had a question on the old lunar module. When they came back to, command module came back to the Earth, did they let it burn up in the atmosphere? Or what? I mean, they were disconnected before they splashed down.
Yeah, they had to disconnect it long before they entered the atmosphere. So it was either ejected early enough to crash to the moon or to go off into space toward the sun on its own.
Okay.
There's one that we think has been found, which was the Apollo 12 that did not land, or excuse me, Apollo 10 that they found, the Snoopy. So the Apollo 10 that did not land, that was the mission right before Apollo 11 that did the dress rehearsal. They did everything except land on the moon. They separated the lunar module and then came back and docked. They got within 60 miles of the lunar surface. That one has been found and is on the moon. It was crashed onto the moon.
And I do remember, in reference to that point, I do remember that at least on one of them, they deliberately timed it and crashed the lunar module after they'd gotten off of it so that they could land near the seismometers and get a seismic recording of it.
Yes. Yes.
Considering the advancements in robotics and imaging technology and everything else that we've seen over the last several decades, what is the justification for risking human life in this way?
So the justification for what?
Can you repeat that? What is the, considering the advancements in robotics, imaging technology, other advancements we've seen in the last decades, what is the justification for risking human life in this way?
You know,
I would say that part of it is that people, they accept the risk. They know what they're getting into, and they know that this is a part of furthering science, because there's a lot of things that you just can't get from a robotic arm, like the orange rock probably would not have been found. You can't actually, there's something different about being an astronaut than being able to touch and to be able to bring back those real life experiences, and I think that's what the American public was able to rally behind, was that they were people. This was exciting. It was something that they could actually emotionally attach to rather than a machine, but that's just my opinion.
well, I think looking back at the Apollo program, Apollo landed for the first time in 1969 and was finished by 1972. Within about 2 years of that time frame, we had the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the first Earth Day. All of these things came out of the public's response to seeing humans looking back at the Earth. And some of the excitement in the general public comes from that. Now, will we have greater science because of the technology of having people there? I think we will, but I understand your question.
Yeah. The big problem is the booster now. They're way behind that booster. That's what's holding them up, right? What's going on there? What's the latest?
The booster is, I think, 75% complete. It's being built at the NASA facility outside of New Orleans. So let's hope the hurricane goes a different direction. It's down there right now. That is on track. Orion's on track. They just last week had the abort system test, and that was successful.
The booster was way behind.
Yeah, I think they've gotten it back in line. So yeah. They were originally going to fly the Gateway up earlier and more of it, but the rocket they're building is the first phase rocket. So they have a second rocket plan. It's the same plan, but it has a greater capability for payload, even beyond what I showed you. So those longer term goals are going to take a little while longer to get there. But
Is there a contractor in that rocket, or is this actually being built by NASA itself?
It's at the NASA Macau facility that builds rockets directly for NASA, so.
I have a follow-up to what you were asking about robotics. Every major industry has incorporated robotics now. For instance, Amazon, they've got 200,000 robots and distribution centers and fulfillment centers across the nation. They're hiring 300,000 people who are programmers, AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, because robotics never will replace the human as far as controlling the robots. That's what they need, the human element of it. They only help automate tasks. They don't have the intelligence yet to, that's why Amazon's hired 300,000 people to do those higher-end engineering positions to control those robots.
And I think we're going to see that. I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime or not, but robotic technology is so rapidly advancing, but it's more of a repetitive task type of thing right now. It's not an artificial intelligence thing yet, where you can send a robot up and they can walk around the planet and they can make the decisions that we can make. But I think there'll come a time when we send them up there and they build the facility for us before we get there.
And to follow up on that, yeah, I mean, I don't know that robots, even with artificial intelligence, could figure out to take duct tape and do what they did in Apollo 13 to, bring the folks back. So my question is on privatization, and I have to start with the ISS a little bit before I get back to the return to the moon. So NASA has just said in an NPR article that they're going to do a lot of privatization to the ISS to try to do what they need to do, and it's only funded for the next 6 years, I think it is. And so they have to do privatization. And SpaceX, with Musk and Blue Origin and whoever else are trying to do things there. But for Apollo, or for going back to the moon, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of privatization yet. And so what do you suspect is going to happen on the privatization route to return to the moon and or get to Mars? Because I think both Musk and Jeff Bezos are looking to go to Mars. That's their heart.
Right. Well, I think we are seeing privatization happening with Artemis.
Okay.
I don't remember the companies, and I don't remember which, but they're letting contracts go now. I was down in Houston earlier this year, and on the training floor they had the first gateway that a company submitted, because the company has to submit a prototype of the gateway that they're proposing. So it looks like one of those companies, private companies, will build the gateway.
Okay.
So,
But they're building it for NASA.
Right.
Okay.
They're going to build
I
it.
think he's talking about they're building their own, or building something that so they could go off and
right.
Use the water on the moon or something.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I was talking about it for building it for NASA. Yeah.
Okay. But I think you're right. I mean, we have potentially 3 competitors here, 2 private and 1 NASA, trying to ultimately get to Mars. Could we do it together better?
Or China is coming, or
China,
whoever.
yeah. Right now, it's against the law for us to do anything space with China. The law was passed decades ago. But is China going to be the new Soviet Union? Are they going to be the people that spur us on to the moon and Mars as a race? Because they've already committed. They're going. They're building their own space station. They're going to go to the moon. So, what fueled Apollo may just happen with the Chinese, unless, of course, everybody decides it's silly to have multiple programs. Let's all pool our money and get there faster. Time will tell. So,
if I remember correctly, the SLS and Orion was originally developed for the Constellation program. How many of these other technologies and ideas are carried over?
So, all of that, because of the political environmental changes and, people would come in and they would change the direction of the program, that technology is still there, and I'm sure they're tapping into it. Just like, I think the fastest way to get the SLS up is to tap into the existing technology of shuttle, because you've got, decades of proven technology there. If we were trying to do this with brand new rockets, systems, I mean, you wouldn't put people in it for a long, long time, because you want to make sure it's 100% before you ever let anybody get in it. So I think even though some of those programs stopped, that transfer of technology within NASA is happening to hopefully move things faster.
Your CIA agent is Jeanette EPP, and she was the first African-American female astronaut into the space station. And that was in the year 2018, and they billed her as being CIA agent in 2009. That's why they
Case officer, right?
Right, but, well, it just says CIA officer. Well, one thing, but I'm just saying that's why the CIA thing.
Okay.
She's the first, first African-American female.
She's not going to find out on Earth.
And the concept is women don't really support space, so by promoting female into space, you have more rally of females in the United States to carry on with the space program.
Yes.
That was
Do you know that the first woman in space, of course, was Russian? And at the time she went up, she was expecting, and they didn't know it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion on that, of raising kids up there.
So, yeah.
And right, the kid, the child that was born, the father was also an astronaut, so it's the first person to have both mother and father to be astronauts.
Right. And the child was fine. So,
the child has an astronaut?
No. Other questions?
The SLS is going to use Space Shuttle main engines. Are they building new engines for that, or?
No, they have 16 of them in a warehouse from the shuttle program. So those already exist. It's just a matter of putting the whole stack together and getting them into it. So.
I think they improved them all over. They've operated them somewhere. So it's not the same.
I think they're.
When was the last shuttle launch?
2011.
Was it 2011?
Oh,
So,
my goodness.
yeah, I
8
think.
years ago.
I think those engines were running at 104% of expectation, and the new ones are going to run at 109. I think I saw that this morning. So they're pushing them a little. So
does that mean there going to be more than number of SLS launches would be limited to 4?
Well, they would have to make more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or are they going to try and recover those engines?
I have not heard anybody talk about that.
No, that's not going to throw them away.
Yeah.
Maybe we should give them to SpaceX. They seem to be very good at that.
Well, you know, SpaceX is building, what were they calling it?
Starship.
The Starship, yeah. So, and you hear little fragments coming out from Elon Musk that they're, getting ready to have a little popping launch without tethers. We'll wait and see. So.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this has been an excellent talk. Everybody want me to take their picture before you go?
The CIA agents in the room, please wait.
So there's not another group in this room, so we've got a few minutes if you want to have a discussion after the meeting.
So it's worth showing up?
Yeah. Yes, you will actually.
Have a nice day, event. Is that going to be our next event? Yeah, okay. Let me know when you get there. Next Sunday. What's this Sunday? What time? Might be a nice day. Might be a nice day.
Oh, that's okay. Who's who down there? I know where they're at.
Nice meeting you folks. Is that your mother or something?